Hi everyone, and welcome to my new moon forecast for the upcoming November Scorpio new moon that's going to be happening on the 4th of November. So this is going to be the last of the lunar phases that happens before we enter into eclipse season. As you know, I've already done the forecast for the November lunar eclipse that's happening in Taurus, so you can check that out on my YouTube channel, or you can get the link from my Twitter feed. So we are in Scorpio season, and I suppose it's apt that we have a kind of a Scorpio new moon, and it's an interesting one from a number of respects. I think that one of the key things about it is that it forms some challenging aspects to Saturn and Uranus, which are moving back into orb of their square to each other, ready for that final kind of showdown that happens on the 24th of December. That's been the sort of overriding kind of transit of 2021, really, in many respects. So we'd really, still trying to reconcile old and new, kind of what's traditional and what's unconventional, all that kind of thing. So in terms of this, the overall feel, I think it's going to be a little bit unpredictable. Whenever Uranus is involved, we are talking about increased volatility or certainly unpredictability. And there's definitely a tension between what we feel internally, or what we kind of want for ourselves on a personal level on one hand, versus maybe our kind of social or our public role, or maybe how we want to bring change into the world, if you like. So there's a little bit of a tussle kind of going on there, but there are opportunities, I think, for learning, for healing, and for shadow work. So let's get into that in more detail and find out more. So overall, as I was saying, in terms of themes, it's going to be quite intense, volatile and challenging, this energy, because of the difficult aspects to both Saturn and Uranus. So the Sun and the Moon are coming off of a square to Saturn, and they are applying to an opposition to Uranus. So Uranus is in Taurus, and the Sun and the Moon are in Scorpio. And this particular dichotomy, I think, is very interesting. I mean, it's a fixed energy, so it tends to be quite... the tension between the two things tends to be quite pronounced, because both are quite set in their ways and quite stubborn, and not very fluid in terms of being willing to compromise or kind of deviate from their position, if you like. And then on top of that, the polarity really kind of keys into ideas around meaning and I think level, particularly in terms of, like, for example, with Taurus tends to be quite practical, pragmatic, to see things to take things at face value, if you like, and to do what is practical under the circumstances, even if that is the tried and tested method. They don't tend to be particularly sort of a sign that pushes a lot for change. It's just kind of whatever works. Whereas Scorpio tends towards depth, so there's this kind of difference between surface level and depth. And then on top of that, Scorpio does tend to see into things, but sometimes not always clearly. It depends on how clear perception is. Sometimes if we are coming from a shadow space, or we're feeling a little bit paranoid, we can see enemies everywhere, when in fact actually it's just our projections. It's just shadow play, if you like. And that's, in that sense, Taurus can be helpful, because it can help us to kind of get back to basics and to question our assumptions, and to kind of go, is that really the case? Or are we actually just sort of like reading too much into things, to the point where we're sort of losing perspective a little bit? And of course, with Scorpio, there's also the aspect of power. This wanting to be in control, sometimes to be a little bit OCD. Occasionally, if we kind of flip in too much into that Pluto ruled energy, to want to strategize to the point of manipulation, kind of behind the scenes machinations, or to be a little bit nefarious, to kind of like sabotage others, to spread rumors, to badmouth, that kind of thing at the sort of the worst end of the scale. Because we're trying to hedge against things that we're afraid of. With Scorpio, there's a lot of fear often, which I think gets overlooked, because we tend to see Scorpio as being fearless, but I think only when it's coming from its kind of eagle type position. So from that eagle-eyed viewpoint, that higher perspective, not when it's kind of like mired in the mud. So, I think it's important to sort of discern between these two things. And I think perhaps what these difficult aspects will highlight is where we may have kind of become too mired in shadow, or in fear, or kind of paranoia, or sort of in wanting to be in control because it makes us feel safe, versus sometimes, they need to just go back to sort of almost just go back to what feels natural, what comes easily, what flows, and also what is kind of common sense, because I think that's where Taurus is really, really good. So generally speaking, this is fixed water energy, because both the sun and the moon are on the same side of the horizon, and that highlights for us things like stuck emotions, blocked emotions, anywhere where we are kind of fixated, or we've become a little bit obsessed or addicted. It also highlights things like deep memory in here. I think, particularly Samhain is a time when we talk about, like the Day of the Dead and that kind of thing, where ancestral ties and memories and things become very strong, and we start to see perhaps family patterns or beliefs, or if you kind of get into sort of the shamanic aspect, how perhaps these ancestral patterns are part of our karma, and we've kind of inherited them, and they become part of our energetic field, for example, our kind of deep memory, and that there might be a need for some cleansing or purging, some shadow work, to make sure that we are clear vessels for information, and that we haven't become a little bit sort of too bogged down in a lot of baggage from the past, which some of it, of which might not even be ours. And then also, on the positive side with Scorpio, we can move towards truth, transmutation and healing. And as I say, when we look at the aspects of Saturn, we'll see that there are definitely some potential here for that type of work. So in general, the key planets here are Saturn and Uranus. So Saturn is pointing us to, interestingly enough, is pointing us to the need to connect and to overcome fear and limitation. We've got a lot of aspects happening between the personal planets and both Saturn, Uranus, Neptune and Pluto, and sort of over the course of November. And Saturn is an interesting one, because it is a social planet, and in some respects it can be about connecting to the collective, in the sense of remembering our responsibilities, on kind of doing what's difficult, and setting limitations, laws or boundaries, kind of being the parent, or the parental figure, or the sort of the leader who fulfills that role. Sometimes, strong leaders have to say no. They can't always sort of say yes in the kind of Jupiterian sense. There needs to sometimes be a little bit of discipline. And then Uranus, which, as I say, is urging us to go back to basics in terms of our thinking, to question our assumptions, and to try and be inventive or innovative from that perspective, to become solutions focused. And obviously this pertains particularly to personal habits, or areas where we may have got stuck psychologically or emotionally, but it can extend to other things. It depends on where the luminaries fall in your chart, for example, and also where Saturn and Uranus sit. And then in terms of aspects, as I say, we are talking about the square, which is quite tense energy, particularly fixed squares. So this is really about the challenge of squaring kind of inner limitations, fear and inhibitions and hang-ups and that kind of thing. Shame as well. So coming to terms with bringing things to the surface. This is what I think Scorpio is so good at, is bringing things to the surface where we may have got stuck, where we may have got limiting beliefs, or we may be operating from a position of fear or inhibition, shame, fear, guilt and shame, that kind of thing, in order to sort of remove blocks and move forward. And then, as I say, the opposition is really highlighting this idea of the exoteric versus the esoteric. So taking things at face value versus hidden meaning. Sometimes we can read way too much into a situation. I've had that, recently on my astrology feed, where I'll put up something about, say, dogs, and I'm really just talking about like dogs, and people will read all sorts of meanings into it, like I must be talking about certain cryptocurrencies like Shiba Inu or Dogecoin, that kind of thing. And sometimes, although it's good to sort of read into things and to sort of seek the deeper meaning, sometimes there is no meaning like deeper than the face value. And I think it's developing that sense of discernment and also limitation, where we can sort of learn to switch off our kind of our need to sort of, as I say, look in every single corner for a kind of like a bogeyman, where we often like none exist, you know, and also, as I said, to kind of balance the everyday versus the sacred. You know, Uranus and Taurus is an interesting one. Obviously, it highlights for us changes in finance in particular, but also things like shifts in our food habits, and those kind of things. So, you know, that might be worth bearing in mind, but because often, you know, if we think about the luminaries, we're talking about sort of very deeply ingrained personal habits or ways of viewing things, or kind of where we kind of in a comfort zone, and the things that we tend to have a lot of emotional baggage around are things like money and food and sex and you know, power and all the things that the Taurus Scorpio polarity tend to rule. So it's worth sort of thinking about. There may be some external circumstances that sort of like bring this to your attention, but essentially, you know, we are dealing with a new moon here, so it's a good opportunity if you have noticed problems being thrown up, particularly as the inner planets have moved from that Jupiter energy to the Pluto energy, and from Saturn to Neptune, and from Saturn to Uranus. Whether it's through contrast, it's highlighted for you any areas where you know you want to set some intentions to do some shadow work, or you want to move yourself in a much more kind of healthy direction, if you like, where you know you've perhaps got a little bit stuck. But overall themes are about kind of experimentation, pushing boundaries, challenging assumptions, and extending knowledge. And this originates essentially from the Sabian Symbol, which obviously I'll get into in a minute. So being a pioneer, you know, also accepting yourself as being unique. You know, I think that combination of the luminaries plus Uranus is all about kind of accepting where we are unique and where we may differ from other people, and how sometimes that can make us feel like an outsider or not accepted. But on the other hand, it's also our kind of unique gift or USP, if you like. And I think it's a question of just sort of going with it and actually accepting it, and you know, and then it becomes a plus rather than a minus. You know, it's not always worrying about the naysayers or the haters, and instead focusing more on your fans and those people that have got your back and who kind of get you, if you like. And then it also, I think it does definitely extend to knowledge. So thinking outside the box, particularly when it comes to the way that we approach technology and finance. You know, how can the organic and the technological merge? I think that's an interesting question. How can we learn to use our intellect and our curiosity in a way that pushes through tensions, to find solutions, to find, you know, positions of compromise? Where can we discover new things? So where is it that we know we don't know enough about something, and we want to sort of push the envelope and kind of like connect up the dots? And for me, this is very much about beginner's mind. I think it's quite a useful metaphor, actually, because this for me is the start of creative intelligence. Is kind of going back to first principles and going, okay, if I know nothing, what am I seeing? How am I viewing this problem? How can I just, you know, kind of see it as through the eyes of a child? And very often that's the starting point for a lot of like creativity and innovation. And especially if we drop the fear of failure, you know, if we're prepared to sort of like play a little bit, like play in the mud, play in the sandbox, get our hands dirty, see where it ends, you know, kind of be a little bit more open-ended rather than in that very, very fixed, quite rigid energy of the fixed signs. So those are some of the themes to, you know, for the next couple of weeks. Now, in terms of the Sabian Symbol, we're talking about the 13th degree of Scorpio, and this is an invented experimenting in the lab. So you can see how it fits in very, very nicely with this kind of Uranian energy that I've been talking about. So again, Linda Hill is talking here about creating one's vision, thinking creatively, and making decisions in the moment, because that's very Uranian, is to sort of go with your gut, to go with your kind of first instinct. And very often that's can seem quite illogical, especially to other people, but if it works for you, it works for you. I mean, I've got a Sun-Uranus conjunction, and very often I'll make decisions that to others seem a little bit irrational, but they work for me. It's kind of my splenic intelligence, if you want to talk in terms of like human design, and I find it works very well for me. Like even when I'm kind of trading like cryptocurrencies and that kind of thing, I will see a trade, and I won't necessarily be able to justify it with technical analysis, but I'll just see it. Then sometimes I'll just know, like, just take the trade. Like there's nothing to sort of to tell me tangibly that something's going to go up, but then it does, and sometimes it'll be like by say 30%, and then I'll be glad that I've listened to my gut. But of course, it is important to balance Uranus with Saturn, so always manage risk. There's always that kind of aspect to things. But yes, I mean, it's interesting that she says, taking calculated risks to see what will happen. So really kind of having an experimental, open-minded viewpoint, where we are questioning our assumptions. So not assuming that something's going to turn out badly just because it has in the past or it has for somebody else, and being willing to sort of take a leap of faith and see where something goes. And again, it's interesting that she talks about going by one's gut reactions. Very often that's how a lot of scientists have innovated. They've either had interesting dreams or they've just sort of had this hunch and kind of gone off in a certain direction. And I think more credence needs to be given to that intuitive, creative side of us, instead of always having this false separation, I think, between science and sort of intuition, that kind of thing, because very often the two go hand in hand. And then of course on the negative side, not kind of getting too bogged down by as I say, tunnel vision, which is a huge fault of fixed signs. They can become very, very set in their ways and entrenched in their viewpoints. So really allowing ourselves to become a little bit more fluid. And here I think some positive aspects to Neptune will certainly help with that. It can also be about like incessant risk taking, which is not really great either. You don't always want to be sort of like flopping around and kind of lurching from one mistake to another like a bull in a china shop. So like with any good experiment, you have your controls and you sort of set things up so that there are some kind of safety measures or safety valves kind of built in, and also sort of keeping track of what you're doing. So they need to be a little bit methodical, which I think Taurus is very good at, and not ignoring warning signs, but at the same time not allowing warning signs to become when we're in a triggered space, we're in that fight or flight mode where we tend to become hypervigilant, or we sort of startle easily, and very often it's not actually the stimulus that is a danger. It's because we're in such a hyper alert sort of state of being. We haven't allowed ourselves to relax enough, so that we take the signal as being like a bigger warning, like danger sign than is necessary. So I think it's very good to try and find ways to relax, try and find ways to center, because whenever Uranus is involved in a kind of a luminary phase, there's always the potential for heightened anxiety and tension in the body. The electrical activity of the body tends to get a little bit overstimulated and scrambled. So it's important to find ways to sort of relax, to let off steam, to ground in particular. And also not to go too deeply into one's emotions so that we end up in obsessive thinking or kind of ruminating to the point where we get a bit sort of depressed, or we see everything through the glass darkly, if you like. So yeah, those are some of the sort of key themes that the Sabian symbol is kind of highlighting for us. And then in terms of the cheat sheet, as usual, I've prepared one for you so you can see where the new moon falls and what kind of life area it's highlighting for you. So as usual, just look for your rising or your ascendant sign, and that will be where both the sun and the moon will be. So this is a good place for pressing the reset button, for setting intentions, for sowing kind of new seeds or starting new projects. So I'll leave you to pause the video and kind of have a look in more depth, and I'm going to get onto the astrology chart. So, in terms of kind of overall energies, we can see with the aspect grid here that the main aspects are between the Sun and the Moon are this separating square to Saturn, which we can see here. Here we've got Saturn and Uranus. And as I said, although it's making a square to the luminaries, it is making some very positive aspects to both Chiron and to Black Moon Lunas on one hand and the North Node in Gemini on the other. So this is kind of interesting. It seems to sort of suggest that if there is any tension thrown up by, particularly within us, emotionally, psychologically, or in our body, by this kind of square to Saturn, it may offer or kind of highlight for us places where we could heal. So if you think about Black Moon Lilith, for example, Black Moon Lilith is about the dark side of the moon. So where are our blind spots? What are we hiding from ourselves? What are we projecting onto other people that's actually our stuff, our baggage? With Chiron, like, where are we feeling as though other people are criticizing us, blocking us, limiting us, or in some way shaming or kind of making us feel like less than, and then kind of looking for ways to flip that on its head so that you can do some key shadow work. And of course, the two signs there are Aries and Gemini, so we are talking about things like communication, thinking, self-expression on one hand, also travel sometimes, all kind of modes of transport. And then with Chiron, we're talking about, very often, this kind of masculine energy, which we all have. So maybe looking at wounds around masculinity, where do we feel criticized for taking the initiative, or where do we feel helpless or like we don't have agency, and sort of working on, if we think back to that full moon in Aries that we just had, it might have brought up some stuff for you around that. And then, how you can sort of reconcile those by either shifting your beliefs, changing the way you communicate, or simply maybe cutting out certain ways of communicating or ways of thinking, or certain beliefs, and kind of looking at how you can reconcile your sort of principles on one hand, and then your kind of habits, your personal habits, and kind of day-to-day practices on the other, your behavior. And then, of course, as I said, we do have this approaching opposition to Uranus by both the Sun and the Moon. So Uranus is close by, but it's in Taurus, so it's still retrograde here in Taurus. And you can see that it's making this big opposition to the luminaries down here in Scorpio. And this is also kind of interesting. As I say, I do think that it has a lot to do with trying to find the balance between what is kind of self-evident or like obvious, like the obvious solution to something on one hand, versus the need to sort of delve deeper and to sort of look below the surface on the other. And also just sort of, I think with that comes the need to learn to trust one's intuition, because both Uranus and Scorpio are both very intuitive signs, but the intuition often comes from a different place. With Scorpio, the intuition tends to be more emotive, or kind of come from the emotional body and from like an inner feeling, if you like, whereas with Uranus it tends to be more sort of the mental body, but linked, as I say, to that kind of splenic intelligence, which is, it happens like lightning fast, and it doesn't repeat itself very often, whereas the Scorpio energy tends to sort of linger in the body and sometimes get stuck there, so I think it's a good opportunity to find ways to sharpen one's perception, and also to sort of open up to where we may have become a little bit, as I say, blocked due to either fear, rigidity, mistrust, or on the other hand of being a little bit anxious, erratic, and not sort of like having enough structure, to either understand our intuition, like what it's trying to tell us, or indeed to sort of balance out those electrical circuits that can otherwise sometimes get a little bit overloaded. I mean, again, a lot depends on where Uranus falls in your chart, and where Scorpio sits as well, as to what this sort of this polarity is kind of about. But you know, if you think about, you know, traditional themes of Scorpio, we are talking about spring versus autumn, you know, nature in its different forms. So kind of life versus death, you know, sex versus, I suppose, death to an extent, you know, the life force versus the sort of like Thanatos. And also things like banking, financing, farming, food on the one hand, which is very Uranian or Taurus on the one hand, versus Scorpio, which is much more about power, about what's hidden, kind of, you know, behind the scenes kind of machinations, as well as like repairing things, healing things. You know, so it can be like Phoenix from the ashes type of energy, so reviving things from the dead almost, if you like, but also accepting, you know, the role that sometimes, you know, when something has kind of reached the end of the line, you know, sometimes it's good to accept that and not to sort of like move into that energy of like fear, guilt and shame. Like, why did it end? What did I do wrong? Sometimes something just reaches the end of its cycle, you know, and it's part of the natural cycle. And sometimes it will die and it won't be reborn, and other times it'll come back in a stronger, better form, you know. So yeah, I think lots to sort of think about there. But then on the positive side, as I say, the Sun and the Moon are moving to approach a trine to Neptune, and of course we've not had good Neptune aspects for a long time, but because we're now in water energy, you know, in Scorpio season, Neptune is kind of coming back into its own, if you like. So I think bringing back the sort of compassionate, dreamy, caring, forgiving energy of Neptune, and I think that can really soften, particularly Scorpio energy. It can soften stubbornness. It can make us see things from a more loving perspective, rather than a defensive or need like a defensive position or a need to sort of dominate. You know, to see that there is room for everybody. You know, like Neptune is so inclusive, and sometimes the need to lower our guard a little bit, so we can become too sort of like God and too paranoid and be convinced that everybody's out to get us or whatever it is, when in fact that might not be the case, you know. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how that kind of plays out in the next couple of weeks, but it's definitely there and we can tap into it if we like, and I think it would really help, as I say, to sort of soften us out of the slightly more harsh Pluto aspects in particular that we are kind of experiencing, you know, and have been experiencing since probably about September. And then finally, down here at the bottom, we've got Mars also in the same sign. You know, Mars changed signs a couple of days ago and moved into Scorpio, and this is its night rulership. So to an extent, it's where Mars feels comfortable. It's quite strategic energy, but it can also be a little bit sort of like ruthless. So again, just a need to temper that energy that we saw at the Aries full moon with the Mars square to Pluto. It's similar. It can be similar energy if it's expressed negatively. You know, think about Rubaeus, for instance, in the Geomancy deck, where it can be about sort of ruminating over things, feeling hard done by, getting stubborn, wanting revenge, you know, all that kind of stuff, which is such a waste of energy. And then Mercury is still in Libra, but will change signs shortly, and it's kind of moving between Jupiter, Pluto and Venus. So it's doing what, you know, Mars did last month and what Venus did the previous month. So kind of following it in the footsteps. And so we'll see that tension that we've had, you know, since, I think it's probably since September. We'll see that tension as Mercury moves from Jupiter, which is very expansive, optimistic ways of thinking, to Pluto, which is obviously a lot more suspicious, guarded, and wants to like sabotage or be a bit gossipy, that kind of thing, to Venus, which is again a lot more expansive and forgiving and sort of tolerant, if you like, because, you know, Venus is currently in Sagittarius, although, you know, Venus is again on, it's sort of at the cusp, it's about to change signs. So a lot of stuff that's sort of at the end and beginning of signs, which I think is interesting, that kind of liminality. I think, you know, we're in that kind of gateway energy where we're moving towards eclipse season, which, as I say, will start on the 19th of November. And so I think it's good to see this new moon in that way, that it is kind of liminal. And we're kind of tying up some loose ends in some respects with the Scorpio energy, but we're also beginning sort of new energy on the other with Uranus and Taurus. And of course, you know, that lunar eclipse is going to be very, number one, Taurian, because it happens in the sign of Taurus, but secondly, also Uranus is very prominent in a good way. So I think if we can kind of get the tense side of Uranus out of the way now, then I think we're kind of prepping ourselves well for that upcoming lunar eclipse, which is very unique in many respects. So if you haven't watched my forecast, I do suggest checking it out, because I think you might be pleasantly surprised actually at some of the themes. The other thing that I'm just, before I move on, I want to just highlight is that Mars is, you know, it's kind of approaching a conjunction to Neptune, but it's also approaching a square to Saturn, and that can feel very frustrating, you know, if we're trying to sort of make progress and to push through blocks and that kind of thing. I think the thing to do is not to force anything, to just maybe fall back more into that Neptunian energy of flow, because the Mars-Saturn combination can be extremely frustrating, and if you can really feel like we're banging our head against a brick wall if we insist that something has to happen now, in particular, if we're very impatient. You know, except sometimes that the timing is off, and that's okay, you know. Things can turn out a lot better if we just allow things to sort of like flow, and if they're not flowing, just to leave them alone a little bit, and try again in a little while. You know, I think that's also maybe sane advice or sage advice, you know, under the circumstances. Okay, and then of course we get on to the fixed star aspects. So this time of the year, the sun and the moon do tend to form parents with some of the fixed stars that we, you know, that are similar, if you like, because they're in similar positions in the sky. But yeah, so the sun and the moon will be making a parent with Alphecca, which is the alpha star in the constellation of Corona Borealis, and we tend to sort of see this as the northern crown. It's kind of like the jewel in the crown, the northern crown, or the laurel wreath. That's how the Greeks saw it. The bridal tiara of Ariadne when she wed Dionysus. So here it's linked to things like quiet achievements or an elevation in social status, often through fortunate partnership or a love match. But I do think that that's got a slightly sort of sexist overtone to it. I think it's just through quiet achievement, essentially, through you know, somebody who kind of does things without having to sort of draw attention to themselves or what they're doing. They just do it because they feel it's the right thing to do. And very often they are on some level overcoming the odds. So they may have had to overcome a difficult background or some kind of like setback or a lot of suffering or failure in their lives. And so, I mean, for example, during the US presidential elections last year, we saw it quite prominent at both elections and at the inauguration of Joe Biden. And I was saying that I thought it was quite apt, because given that he has run for president and for various positions quite often and not been successful, and you know, he's suffered a lot of setbacks in his own life, you know, with the death of his wife and his some of his children, and so we do often see a prominent and kind of what we call crownings, you know, of people who overcome the odds and sort of like go on to become successful despite you know, difficulties. So with the sun and the moon, it's often associated with somebody who's got a special gift or talent, one that leads to a fruitful life, and as I said, very often after overcoming adversity on some level, but also somebody who wants to leave a legacy and who, you know, wants to kind of share their gifts and their sort of talents with others. Sometimes there's a link to creativity in the arts, sometimes to children as well. Bernadette Brady says that in particular there's a link between the moon, Alphecca, and things like poetry and you know, it's the theatre and to song, that kind of thing. So that's just worth keeping in mind. And then Yeah, and then the second paran is to Acrux, which is the Alpha star in the Southern Cross. Now, many astrologers associate this with the so-called cross of matter, which in a way you could say the angles represent, you know, the ascendant-descendant MC-IC axis. So this has to do with physical incarnation of the soul and the suffering that this can bring. So many people see the sort of esoteric understanding of the crucifixion as being about the suffering that a soul encounters or sort of goes through when it becomes mired in materialism and, you know, and tends to forget its origins. So, you know, that's just worth bearing in mind. In other words, the human condition. But according to Vivian Robson, this particular constellation is associated with the nature of Jupiter. So overall, it's got quite a positive sort of connotation to it, this constellation, where it bestows piety, seriousness, patience, and empathy, as well as deep intuition, often born from many burdens, trials, and responsibilities. So interesting again that we're having this idea of deep intuition, which is very Scorpio, but it's born from the trials and burdens and responsibilities that come from suffering, which, as I say, I think is reflected in those difficult aspects that we got to both Uranus and to Saturn. So, as I say, I do think there's going to be a silver lining, even though this might be quite a challenging, tricky 2 weeks. I do think that at the end of it, we are going to sort of come out the other end and think, you know, maybe that we're better people for having been through whatever we kind of go through, or just, as I say, that we have this perspective shift, that we move out of this obsession with suffering and kind of move into the energy of growth through joy and bliss and flow. And then Bernadette Brady interprets this particular combination with the luminaries as being about a desire to succeed and to be accepted by mainstream society on one hand, so that's obviously very solar energy, and also with a desire to do well financially, so to create financial security for self, family, and others. And yeah, I mean, I think that also fits quite well with Uranus and Taurus, which is, as I say, very much concerned with material pursuits, and with Saturn, which, you know, even though it's in Aquarius, it does want to be, Saturn at base is quite traditional, and it does want to be accepted by its peers. So I think there is sort of that desire to be seen to be contributing to society and to be a sort of respected member of society on some level. So I think lots of interesting themes, you know, as I say, during this 2-week period, where we are kind of, I think, trying to, in a way, marry deep internal processes and stuff with and the sort of the desire to be ourselves and to be authentic on one hand, with also the need to be accepted by others, and that kind of that dichotomy, that tension that often forms between those two things. So yeah, I hope that's conjures up some interesting things for you to consider. Yeah, and that's kind of it from me, short and sweet. Again, just a reminder that I'll be doing eclipse horoscopes for members of my website. I have also just, if you go to my website and you go to the shop, I've just launched a brand new shop, and you can actually subscribe now. I've launched some memberships, which will give you sort of access to various areas of my website. So even though I used to do sort of eclipse horoscopes free to all my members and my subscribers, I am now kind of limiting it to paid members. But you know, the free subscription will still include my bi-monthly newsletter, which has a link to the personal monthly horoscopes and things like that. So yeah, go to my website and subscribe if you're interested. The link is astrologysphere.com/subscribe. And yeah, wishing you all the very best for the upcoming 2 weeks. And yes, don't forget about the eclipse forecast that I've done for that lunar eclipse in Taurus on the 19th of November, because that's already up on YouTube, so you can go and check that out if you're interested. But anyway, all the best, take care, and have a good fortnight.